Welcome to the Roots of Success, the premier landscapers podcast that brings you the latest tips and strategies for successful landscape business. I'm Jim Calley, one of the principals and coaches of McFarlin Stanford. Jason New and I started McFarlin Stanford to coach landscape businesses after years in the industry ourselves. Now, more than 10 years since we began, McFarlin has a deep bench of coaches and subject matter experts who work with our clients on very specific issues of business. Whether you're struggling with people, profits, or just day-to-day challenges, our coaches and guests have the real-world experience and practical advice to help you build a thriving and profitable landscape business.
Welcome to another episode of Roots of Success. I am your guest host, Kevin Keim with McFarlin Stanford, and I am joined today by Dauphin Ewart, who is one of our facilitators as well. Welcome, Dauphin.
Hey, Kevin. How are you today, man?
I'm doing well. Happy Friday to you, sir. Why don't we start, Dauphin, by having you do a quick introduction? I know you speak at Connect. I know you're always a packed house session, but you are a facilitator in our PACE groups, and so may not have a lot of exposure to the rest of our ACE members or meet people that you've seen it grow, et cetera. So if you want to maybe just give everybody a little bit of a background of like who you are, what you do, what you like to do besides playing your guitar, multiple guitars, that'd be great if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. So yeah, like Kevin said, I've been the facilitator for the Pest group for PACE for the last 4 years plus. And it's been a blast to be a facilitator with McFarlin. And in my other life, I own and operate a pest control company based out of Austin, Texas. I say based out because we're a 3-location company and we serve 4 major markets in that. So we serve San Antonio, the Austin market, the Temple market, and then also the Houston market out of the Woodlands. And we're in the 80 range in terms of head count. So this isn't just something that I coach and talk about. It's something that I live every single day. And it's a big part of what I do.
Yeah. And so I have known Dauphin for, I think this number is north of 10 years. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on that because I don't need to feel bad about how old I am. And we won't talk about your age in this process. We'll just keep it about me so that I don't insult you. But I've known Dauphin forever, great friend, great peer in the industry. And I think one point maybe, Dauphin, you wouldn't mind spending, like you didn't found the company, but you're the second generation or third, remind me.
I'm a second generation, yeah. So my dad started the company in 1981, and then I came back in the mid-2000s. So I've been running the company for just north of 20 years now. And this is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart because this is all lessons that I've taken in my career, growing a company and trying to do a great job at it. So yeah, this has very much been my story.
Yeah, great. Well, we're going to talk, so without further ado, let's talk about the topic or theme of today, which is the 5 mistakes super busy people make, which I'm confident can be most listeners to our podcast can relate to this, right? And in your experience, these 5 are all topics that you helped us create. They're yours. So let's start with the first, which is no real boundaries around their time. So what have you learned in your day-to-day job running a company with 80 plus employees about defining boundaries?
Well, Kevin, why don't we start with just the concept of busy, right? And one of the reasons that I want to start there, and I know this is part of my story and other people may relate to this, but a lot of us, being busy is almost important, right? Like how much work you do, working 40, 50, 60 hours. I find that a lot of people are almost proud of just, how much they do, which I'm not saying one shouldn't. And I don't really have a take on how much time people should spend doing what they do. But when I hear that, one of the first things I think, is that what you want? One of the things I really love as a business owner is the idea that you actually do get to be in control of what you want and what you want to spend your time doing and how you spend your time in your life. And so that's always sort of the first thing that I'm curious about is, well, if you're working 50 hours a week and skipping your kid baseball games and whatever else, is that what you want to do? I don't have an answer to that. I can't have an answer to that for you. That's your answer to take. But I find that usually folks who are in that spot are in that spot because they don't feel like they're empowered to change it. right? That they have to be this kind of busy just because there's so much coming at them. And so one of the very first things to me is just the mindset of being busy, right? Are you busy with stuff that's super productive for you? That's exactly what you want on your plate? Or did you just end up with a day that you couldn't control?
Right.
And I think that's a really different thing, right? So, and I say that because, the idea of putting boundaries in place, a lot of business owners that I'll talk to, it's almost as though they couldn't even conceive of it, right? Like if you were to say like, hey, what if you were to stop working at 5? Could you do that? And from a lot of people, you'd probably hear, no, it's not even possible. And so my first argument would be that's actually a decision. And I'm not saying it's the wrong one. I think that's a question for people to make, but I do think it's really important to feel like you can actually decide to do these things. And I think, for some of us, it's necessity, right? Like maybe you have something happen to where, you have a family member you have to take care of, or there's something you want to do, or you have a medical thing that you have to take care of, and you have to, do something every Friday or whatever that might be. And then you have to figure out how to make that boundary work. But even before there's that sort of external necessary boundary, you can ask this question of, what do I want these boundaries to be? And I think as you start to do that, you can find that boundaries are actually a really positive way to figure out what the most important work you do is, right? When you make the box smaller and say, well, only, X number of things are going to fit in this box. Now you have to ask, is everything that I put in the box valuable? And, as we talk about the other sort of 4 mistakes, and again, these are mistakes that really come from my career, right? Like when I look back and started to do this kind of exercise and went, oh man, the answer to a lot of this stuff is no, that's actually not very valuable. And so then, beginning the process of taking it out, can be really great. And, as we talk through it, a big takeaway for me is a lot of times when you have this busyness, right, that you have tons of stuff in the workload, you're commonly making yourself miserable because you're overwhelmed, you're doing way too much stuff. Likely these mistakes are actually making your team miserable because you're probably driving your team nuts with the mistakes that you're making.
Yep.
And finally, you're probably actually getting worse results than you would if you just spent time on the most important things for you. And so yeah.
So part of this, what is a tool or a way that you maybe looked at, your box, to use the expression that you said, and maybe started to look at the prioritization? And I may be skipping ahead in some of the things that you're going to talk about here in a bit, but I just think as if you're in that defining moment, and maybe the backup question is, was there a defining moment for you? Like I know you talked about maybe it's your health or family members' health. Was there a this lightning rod moment where you realized that this change, you needed to make this change for the betterment of you and your family and your company? How did you kind of arrive there?
For me, it really was the question of, am I doing this the way that I want to be doing it, right? And, with, stress from work going into my evenings, just taking over life in general and looking at my habits and kind of going, is this how I have to do this? I don't enjoy having my work life just be all encompassing. And so some of it for me was making the decision that I wanted to manage that. And so luckily for me, it wasn't a health thing. It wasn't one of those other pieces. I only mention those because those are common ones as I've started to, explore this, that I hear from other people. But really just figuring out that it's important to set these boundaries and say, hey, well, this is how much bandwidth I'm going to have. The surprising thing was saying that actually focused me way more on what was really important. And so I'm wanting to kind of jump into the first mistake that I noticed, which is confusing motion with progress. And I want to jump to it because, this is one for me that was really big. I'm a quick start person, right? But one of the other things about quick starts is they don't tend to finish things, right? You'll start a bunch of stuff and you don't finish it, right? So it's sort of the classic example of somebody doing a lot of motion and no progress, right? You spent a day or a week or a month on a project that you got to 23% done, and then something else happened and you got distracted, right? So one of the things that's been super critical in my career is figuring out, what am I going to be working on? And, am I focused on accomplishing objectives, or am I just doing a bunch of activity?
Yep. I think a good, way to maybe frame this, right? Because I think I even said this in the beginning when we started, right? Was talking about your calendar and defining, creating boundaries for that. But then I think the point you're making here is that your calendar also can be the way it becomes the scapegoat. Oh, I'm in back-to-back meetings, or my calendar is busy, I'm overwhelmed. But I think what you're encouraging everyone to do is, is it the highest and best use of your time, not just a box checking exercise of like, well, I had 11 meetings today. Well, great. Well, did you accomplish anything in those meetings, right?
100%. Well, and some of this is kind of this principle of available work expands to fill available time, right? If you give me 3 hours to run a report, I can sort of infinitely riff on it. But if you gave me 5 minutes, would I have gotten to the decision I needed to get to?
Yeah. Yes, probably. You're quick.
And so, reporting is actually a classic thing that I think of here where, I honestly love to say reports aren't work, right? Like the number of people who will spend, hours running reports and messing with reports and reconfiguring them, or, you'll get a report and it'll say a thing. And then you decide, well, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole of running a whole bunch of other reports. And, usually those additional contexts don't contribute hardly anything to your decision, right? And so I actually love the exercise of kind of time boxing things, right? Take something that takes you an hour and do it in 20 minutes. See what happens. How good is the result, right? And, just because you're doing something that looks like work doesn't mean you're actually being productive or working. And so that very first question of like, is what's happening right now motion, or is it progress? I love as a lens through which to look at what you've decided to put on your plate, right? And, a ton of people can cut out, you could probably cut out a day a week of work by looking at, is this motion or progress? What does this contribute? And how much of the stuff that you have on your team members is a bunch of motion and no progress? How many reports do you run that people don't do anything with?
Right.
Do you need those? Right. So I think that's one of the very first and biggest mistakes that I see right out of the gate is motion versus progress.
So when you went through this exercise and asked yourself that question and identified the things that were, motion, or maybe before that, how does that show up in your org, like your team? Like how does that impact them? Just to help our listeners understand, because I don't want to make it sound like it's all about Dauphin here, because it isn't just
it's not. And actually, like the quick start thing is an important part of this, right? Because like if you're creating a lot of motion and not progress, you're actually not generating very many outcomes, but you're generating a whole lot of work, right? And so what happens is your team is all over the place because they don't totally understand where you're going, right? Because you're focused, over here on this for a little bit, and then you're focused here on this for a little bit. But all of those projects, all of those ideas, they really lose the focus of the team rather than bringing the focus back to whatever the thing that you're trying to actually make progress on is. And so one of the major results of focusing on motion versus progress is you create this massive amount of distraction in your team.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the ways that you frustrate team members and you get worse results because you're having people focus on, wild side projects that you came up with rather than on the core things that you really wanted progress on. Yeah. Right. So it's a way in which this isn't just hurting you. It's not just hurting your schedule. It's not just hurting your family time. It's making your business worse.
Yeah.
Right.
I know Dauphin knows this, and I think I maybe mentioned this on past podcasts, but, back when I was running a company myself before, coming full-time with McFarlin, I was banned from flashy things, which was software back then. This was really even before generative AI was this monster that it is today. How does that, because I could see as you made that comment there, I was like, oh man, I was so guilty of that, of like, there's this thing that I'm like, ooh, we should be seeing what this does, right? And then you're adding more to it.
It's funny. I actually think AI has been horrible for the problem of motion versus progress. It becomes so enticing to grab on to something that you can do, and play with, and, beginning from the tool rather than the result, right? Going like, oh, well, with this, we can do all of these crazy things. Whereas if you're starting with the result, right? Like if you're going, man, our big problem is that our training program isn't strong enough. Well, that's anchored here. And that's a long-term strategic piece, right? Does that tool do this thing? Or are you just getting really excited about, generative AI and starting to, create a bunch of content and a bunch of distractions? And so,
which becomes motion, right? Like
which becomes motion,
yeah,
and is motion progress.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think that's one of the most critical pieces to be thinking about. And it's a huge mistake that I see people make.
Yeah.
Massive.
We, as we talked about this, Dauphin, prior to this, there's a quote that you had provided that said, busy people fill their days with motion, but leaders measure their day by outcomes. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's a powerful summary of, helping yourself ask, is this motion or is this progress? And am I advancing, the strategic, initiatives that, your organization needs to work on?
Well, and Kevin, to that point, like there's this really dumb thing that I like to do every day. And I plan my days the same way all the time. And I write down each day 3 outcomes that I'm wanting to accomplish.
First of all, that's not really dumb. There's like scientific studies that prove that this is an effective tool. This isn't dumb. This is great.
But the thing that's fascinating to me is how many days it's possible to sit down and go, I don't even actually know what I'm trying to accomplish today. It's a big red flag, right? That means all the stuff on my plate is probably movement, not outcome, right? Yeah. And so I love that exercise as a way to go like, well, what are the outcomes we're trying to do today or this week or this month, right? And really, I like to tie it to a much longer term, perspective. But yeah, if you can't start each day with, a set of outcomes that you're wanting to accomplish, that's probably a real opportunity for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So mistake number 1 was, not establishing or no real boundaries around your time, which then led us to mistake number 2, which is, confusing motion with progress. We talked a bit about how that impacts your team, which perfectly segues us to, mistake number 3, which is not understanding delegation. So how did you, because this is about this is your mistakes, right? So where did you fall on your face with the delegation and working with your team?
So when I think about delegation, I think about actually giving the full responsibility to someone, which means I'm giving the outcome to them. I'm not giving the tasks to them, right? So if I say, hey, Kevin, here's this thing, you do it by doing these 12 steps. Now I've got 12 things to manage. But if I say, hey, Kevin, here's this thing, here's the problem, and here's the outcome, you come up with the steps. Now, maybe he wants to know how people have done it in the past or whatever, right? Like, so here's kind of how it's been done, but this is the goal I want. And I think a lot of us feel like, well, we've got to, train everybody and tell everybody how to do the exact thing. And so, for instance, for me over the years, like with commissions, I'm a nerd and I like building complicated spreadsheets, right? So I'll build out this whole thing. And so the first time when I was like, I'm going to get this delegated, I gave my spreadsheet to somebody, right? And then what would happen? My spreadsheet would break. And what would happen then?
They'd come back to you.
They'd come back to me.
It was yours. It was your brain on paper.
Or if the process broke, well, it was my process. So I had to manage all 12 of those steps rather than the one outcome, right? Rather than going and saying, hey, this thing is having accurate commission payroll that's on time, right? Here's the report in field work that you use. Here's the commission rates. You guys figure out how to set it up and get in the driver's seat in terms of making this more efficient and faster and all those things so that you understand what we're trying to drive at. And so delegating is really about giving the full outcome to someone, having a way of looking at it to say, yes, that got done or it didn't. And then there's the day-to-day management of, how are the pieces going inside of that? But in a situation where you've really delegated it well, all those problems still live with the person who it's delegated to, right? So if the report's broken, okay, Kevin, if your report's broken, maybe let me know. But let me know that you're working on it. Don't send me an email saying the spreadsheet's broken. Let me know when it's fixed so that I can rerun payroll. Right?
Right.
That means that this whole responsibility is actually still on my plate.
Yeah. So I was just with a peer group this week, and we talked about the process of allowing an employee to, like, to your point, own the outcome. You may have gone, from A to F to accomplish that. They may have gone, Z to F, right? Mm-hmm. But if we have achieved the desirable outcome, then, great. Then it's okay to have that employee. And how that, then it kind of goes against a phrase I feel like I hear a lot in the industry is, well, this is the McFarlin way, or this is the BugMaster way, right? So how did you arrive at that, maybe taking a step back and saying, how do you protect the brand, you protect your core values, but still allow and empower that employee to own it?
Kevin, I love this question. And I love it because, again, going back to delegation, it's the full ownership of the thing, right? So there's things at BugMaster that only I can set. But the team, it's a full team, right? So if there's a way to do payroll, there's one person that's going to figure out how to do that. And it does not have to be me, right? So they can set that way. And, so let's say they come up with a way that is different than what I do, right? So one of the phrases I really like is the other way probably works just as well, right? Meaning I would have put it into a pivot table, but you don't know how to use pivot tables, so you put it into a standard table or whatever it is. It doesn't matter, right? Or I would have used Claude, but you use pivot tables, so you're comfortable with that. the other way probably works just as well, right? And so if I have a problem, one of the tests that I like to sort of have for myself is like, is my discomfort with this, because I'm a very particular person, right? And so I do tend to think like, that's not the way that I would do it. I don't like that. But do I have an actual problem with it, or is it just not the way that I would have done it, right? So like, let's say that you came up with a way that takes 7 hours to do what I could do in 30 minutes. Well, maybe what I want to do is come back and challenge you with the amount of time that your solution took. Well, now you and I are sharing the same problem, right? I'm going, hey, cool. We're aligned on the outcome, but I think we're spending too much money on this. You know, spending 7 hours on this, I think we should be able to do it in 30 minutes. Yeah. But I want to be able to give that whole problem to you, not to solve it for you, right? And then I want you to be the part of BugMaster that owns that result, or the part of McFarlin, or the part of whichever organization that you're talking about, right? Because that really unifies us in that the way that this company does this is generated from the folks who do it. You know, the idea that the BugMaster way is going to be generated by me is absolute insanity. I am not the specialist in everything we do. So why would I be the one who creates our way? I mean, it certainly needs to be consistent with my values, with my vision, with where we're going. And that's important feedback for me. But if it's not in conflict with those, the other way probably works just as well.
Yep. It's a pretty darn good quote. And I think you just perfectly teed it up for your mistake number 4, which is that you're not the everything and everything, or everyone and everything at BugMaster. I'm poorly paraphrasing that for you. But mistake number 4 is being the bottleneck, which can immediately, like, I bet most people who are owners and operators of a company know at times they're the bottleneck. We know that, but it just becomes a challenge to undo it, right?
Well, and actually having those processes is a great example, right? So like, for instance, if I say, hey, Kevin, write a process for how we're going to notify customers, or maybe let's do something simpler. That's, make a process for making sure that all the technicians have the equipment they need every day. Well, I can then go, write that down, show it to me. You and I need to, agree on those steps. I've now injected myself into the whole process in a way that means that all those steps need my approval. And honestly, one of the things I see from folks whose phones ring all the time, right? And folks whose phones ring all the time are usually the folks that I'm looking at here, because their teams have, for some reason, decided that they have to get their approval on everything, right? Hey, I'm going to use this material rather than this material. I got to call Kevin and make sure it's okay. And, in so many ways, there's behaviors that you and I can have that tell people that they need to get our approval on all these things. And by doing that, we make ourselves the bottleneck of everything, because we told everybody, you've got to get my approval. And a lot of people will say, well, no, I didn't tell anybody that. And then I start to dig into, well, what happens when they come and they got a result? And you'll see that they continually question the ways that people do things, especially about relatively unimportant stuff. And so if I don't actually do the delegation well, right? Like, if I don't agree on an outcome with you and focus on that outcome, every time I undermine a judgment that you make, I actually turn myself into a bottleneck, right? Because I go, well, I wouldn't have turned that purple. I would have turned it green. And now Kevin goes, okay, well, why would I do this work if when I finish up the work, I'm going to show it to him and then he's going to tell me how to redo it all over again? Yep. I'm just not going to do the work until I go talk to him. And then I'll do whatever he tells me to do.
And there's a fine line there, right? Because the two examples that you gave, right? The payroll example of, they got there, they got to the desired outcome. It just took 7 hours when it used to take 30 minutes. That is constructive feedback and maybe setting expectations, but it's very different than what you just described, right? And I think but that line, it is a delicate balance to not, teeter too far one direction and shut down an employee's empowerment, which I think is maybe a great way to word what you were just describing,
100%.
But also giving them free rein that leads to an inefficient process or, an unrealistic use of resources or whatever the outcome, part of the steps to get to the outcome may have led to.
Well, and honestly, Kevin, some of that is, like inefficient processes probably drive all of us nuts. And also, you probably have a gazillion of them right now.
Mm-hmm.
The question is how big of a deal they are, right? There are things that it makes sense to have your focus. But again, to me, those should go back to what are the top things that you're trying to make progress on. And, if you're bottlenecking a whole bunch of stuff that has very little to do with what progress would look like, I just think it's something to pay attention to, right? And just notice, like, where does everyone come to you and why do they come to you? And, it's very common that people go, man, I don't know why everybody calls me. And my feedback would be it's rarely a mystery. If you look at the way that you behave, you could figure this out pretty quickly. And usually it's not because you said directly, Kevin, call me on every single thing. Some people actually do that. But what most people do is they don't delegate at the high level and they undermine their team. And they don't recognize at the outset that is going to turn them into a bottleneck on every decision that exists in their organization. And probably if you're feeling like that, you're probably doing those two things. They're incredibly common to do. It's super easy to do. And, when I say it the way that I just said it, it probably sounds a little bit malicious. And for most of us, it's not at all. It's just that I'm a particular person. And if I see something where I'm like, man, I would not have done it that way, I would have organized the truck bed in this other way. And now all of a sudden, I interjected myself into something that really didn't need my interjection, possibly. Yep. And I told everyone that they have to talk to me about every little detail on accident. So If it's a detail that really matters to you, go for it. I'm totally in favor of it. I'm not talking about the ones that you're intending. I'm talking about the ones where you can't imagine why everyone does this, where they all call you. And again, I think it's probably because you messed up delegation, or you delegated, but then you undermined it by not focusing on the outcome, but by focusing on a whole bunch of downstream stuff.
Which then makes you the bottleneck, right?
Makes you the bottleneck every time.
All right. That leads us to mistake number 5, which is mistaking urgency for importance. And so give us an example of where you encountered this, where you felt pressure to make a decision, but it wasn't all that important.
Well, so on this, where I really think about this one a lot of times with things like email. This one happens a lot of times with folks who don't start their days with priorities, and things come in, right? Somebody walks into the office and they say, oh, I think we need new shirts or something, right? And then all of a sudden you have somebody who's immediately starting to work on this thing that wasn't ever set into your priorities. It wasn't ever set into your overall goals, and at times it can be things that feel a bit more important than, say, shirts or something. But, just reacting to the things that are coming across your desk, or the way that other people, members of your organization, might think, oh, well, like we have to get this done today. And if you don't start asking these questions of like, what's driving this urgency? Is this actually a critical thing? Or is it just something that someone else is creating urgency because they want to get it done, or they saw it and they really liked it? And, hey, I was talking to somebody and they have this employee rewards program. We should get it going. I saw in our payroll system, you can do, right? And you end up with this huge project that you didn't plan on, you didn't intend, right? That you didn't scope, and the urgency isn't being driven by the overall importance of your organization. It's just being driven by almost chance in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah.
And so much of this goes back to this whole question of what's really important and what should you be focused on, right? And so for me, these are so many of the ways where, again, when I talk to folks who really feel like they don't have control over their days, they're just incredibly busy, they're doing all these things. So many times I look at these mistakes and, that very first one of not putting boundaries up, that one usually is a catalyst, because it's why so many leaders don't recognize that they're overwhelmingly busy, because like, oh, well, I'm willing to work at 7:00 in the evening or at 9:00 in the evening or whatever it is, which is fine. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Do it if you want. I don't, it doesn't matter one way or the other, but the question of, does all that stuff add up to the things that are truly important to you? And have you actually stopped doing these things and created enough time for yourself to do the work of figuring out what's important to you? Where are you going? What are the most important projects? What is the stuff that can only be on your plate? And then you realize, well, I don't have time to go sit around writing strategy because I'm driving trucks around. I'm taking vehicles to the mechanics. And, those actually aren't jobs that are unique to you.
Yep.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do them. Maybe it's a great choice. What I'm really advocating for is making sure you're being intentional with it, right?
It's a great exercise to go through when you go to like the National Pest Management Association's conference, or, the National Landscapers Association. Like, you go to these things, you hear these ideas, you, in my case, you see software and you're like, ooh, that looks cool. I bet I could do X, Y, and Z with it. And then, you really got to ask yourself, is it really important, right? Is it a need to have, or is it a nice to have? And so that you could, prioritize your time. I think the other thing that came up to my mind is that my past life and my corporate life, I had an employee, a coworker, who everything was urgent. But if you really step back and teams would react, they were in a leadership position at our company and everyone would react. But the reality was they were just wanting it off their list.
Yeah.
And then it became all of us reacted to that, but none of it was actually important. Or maybe it was important, but it wasn't timely. Like it needed done.
Yeah.
It just didn't need done like right now.
Well, and Kevin, as you tell that story, you can see exactly how that creates confusion. It frustrates your team, and it's going to generate worse results, because you could have had your team focused on stuff that actually was driving results. And instead you're, having them lose focus. Everything's coming back to you.
Yep.
And they're going to be more frustrated. You're going to be more frustrated, and the results are going to be worse. And so, the exercise of kind of going through these, and, I'm a huge advocate for getting rid of this busyness mindset. And like, I'm much more interested in productive people than busy people. And productive people know their outcomes. Effective people know their outcomes, right? And And a lot of times the most effective people tend to give a lot of mess.
Yeah. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes a professor in college made to me, which was when everyone's talking about, I'm busy, I'm like, oh, I'm busy. And his response would always be, no one's ever cornered the market on that yet. And it was and he was a business professor, as you could tell, right? And so and I know I probably still to this day say that from time to time, but in the back of my mind, I try to play that quote back to me. It's probably the most impactful thing that I've heard, right? Because it's right. It's like, okay, everyone's busy. No one's cornered the market. So let's move past that. Let's talk about what are you doing to be productive? All right. So Dauphin, to recap here for us. So your 5 common mistakes that you have personally made and are working. And I'm going to use a word, I'm going to sound crazy for a minute and talk about yoga that you're practicing, because to your point, this is a practice. This is all 5 100%. Of these things you're going to have to work at to be good at, right?
And they change over time.
Yeah.
100%.
So the mistake 1 was, not setting real boundaries, around your time. Mistake 2 was confusing emotion with progress. Mistake 3 was not understanding true delegation. Mistake 4 was being the bottleneck. And then our last mistake, at least of today's discussion, was mistaking urgency for importance and how important those are. So I greatly appreciated the conversation today. So thank 100%. You so much for your time. And for those of you, we will see you all on our next episode of The Roots of Success.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Roots of Success, brought to you by the subject matter experts at McFarlin Stanford. Have a question you want our coaches to tackle in a future episode? You could submit that at McFarlinStanford.com/podcast. And to find more helpful content from McFarlin Stanford, follow us on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. If this or any of our episodes have piqued your interest in ACE peer groups, we encourage you to join us at ACE Discovery. Just check out the events tab at McFarlinStanford.com. This is Jason New, co-founder and principal at McFarlin Stanford. We'll see you next time.